The stagecoach bucked and swayed, a fragile wooden shell tossed on an ocean of dust and heat. Inside, Stephanie Moss kept her gaze fixed on the blur of the Arizona landscape, a canvas of scorched earth and skeletal saguaros painted in shades of rust and ochre. The town of Redemption was still a day's ride away, another stop on a journey that had no real destination, only a perpetual forward motion away from a past she could barely remember, and toward a future she couldn't imagine. She was a ghost haunting the territory, her presence as thin and unsubstantial as the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon sun that pierced the coach's dim interior. Her fellow passengers, a portly merchant and his wilting wife, had long ago given up trying to draw her into conversation. She offered them nothing, no pleasantries, no shared stories, only a quiet, unnerving stillness. Her hands, calloused from years of labor that belied her 23 years, rested on the worn leather satchel in her lap. It held everything she owned, a change of clothes, a small pouch of coins meticulously saved, and a dog-eared book of poetry. Everything that is, except the one item that truly mattered. Her fingers strayed to the hollow of her throat, to the cool, familiar weight of the silver locket tucked beneath the collar of her dress. It was simple, unadorned, its surface, worn smooth by the touch of 3 generations. Inside, 2 miniature portraits, faded and hazy, were all that remained of the parents influenza had claimed when she was 8. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was her anchor, the only proof that she had ever belonged to anyone. A sudden, violent jolt threw them all from their seats. The merchant's wife shrieked as the coach lurched to a halt, sent the driver's frantic shouts cut short by the sharp, definitive crack of a rifle. Another shot followed, and the world outside erupted into a cacophony of panicked horses and menacing voices. Everybody out now. The door was wrenched open, revealing a man whose face was obscured by a grimy bandana. He brandished a pistol with casual menace. Stephanie moved with the numb obedience of the others, her mind a cold, clear space of calculation. She had survived ambushes of a different sort her whole life. The quiet cruelty of a resentful aunt, the sharp-edged charity of strangers, the gnawing hunger of abandonment. This was just louder. They were herded out into the blinding sun, blinking against the glare. 5 riders, lean and hard, as strips of jerky held them at gunpoint. They were efficient, their movements economical, and devoid of wasted energy. But one man stood apart, sitting atop a magnificent black stallion. He wore no mask. He seemed to feel no need for one. His face was sharp and intelligent, framed by dark hair, but it was his eyes that held the desert's chilling emptiness. They were the eyes of a raptor, cold and assessing, missing nothing. "Empty your pockets. Hand over your valuables," one of the bandits snarled, moving down the line of trembling passengers. The merchant fumbled with his wallet, his wife tearfully removing her rings. But the man on the black horse was not watching them. His gaze swept past the golden jewels, his focus unnervingly intense, as if he were searching for something specific. His eyes landed on Stephanie. They did not just see her. They seemed to dissect her, peeling back the layers of dust and weariness to find something hidden beneath. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He moved with a predator's grace, each step deliberate and full of lethal purpose. He stopped directly in front of her. The other bandits paused, watching their leader. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken tension. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, smell the scent of leather and gunpowder and something else, something acrid and unsettling like cold ash. "You," he said. His voice was not the rough growl of a common highwayman. It was articulate, cultured even, which only made it more terrifying. "What is your name?" Stephanie's throat was dry. "Stephanie Moss." A flicker of something recognition, satisfaction passed through his cold eyes. "Moss," he repeated the word, a soft hiss. He reached out not for her satchel or the few coins she possessed, but for the delicate chain around her neck. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against her skin as he hooked the chain and pulled. The locket emerged from beneath her collar, glinting in the harsh sunlight. "This," he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is what I've come for." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Stephanie's composure. "No," she breathed, her hand instinctively flying up to protect it. "Please, it was my mother's. It's all I have." His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment she saw not just emptiness, but a profound and ancient grief, so deep it had curdled into something monstrous. "Your family has a debt to pay," he said, his voice laced with a chilling intimacy that terrified her more than any threat of violence. "Consider this the first installment." With a sharp tug, he snapped the delicate chain. He held the locket in his palm, studying it for a moment before closing his fist around it. He had taken her past her only connection to a life where she had been loved. He had ripped out her anchor and left her adrift. He turned, ignoring the stunned silence of the other passengers and the bewildered looks of his own men. "We're done here," he announced, swinging back onto his horse. "But boss," one of the men protested, gesturing to the merchant's pile of money. "The haul." "I have what I came for," the leader said, his gaze fixed on some distant point on the horizon. His men, confused but obedient, mounted their horses. The leader turned his cold eyes on Stephanie one last time. "Remember my name," he said, his voice carrying on the hot, dry wind. "It is Silas Blackwood, and I am a man who always collects what he is owed." And then they were gone, melting back into the desert that had birthed them, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence more profound than any noise. The merchant's wife was sobbing, the driver was checking on his wounded guard, but Stephanie stood frozen, her hand pressed to the hollow of her throat where the locket had once rested. The robbery had not been random. It had been a message, a targeted act of violation. Silas Blackwood had not just stolen from her. He had marked her. In the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Arizona territory, a cold, calculated vendetta had just begun. Redemption was a town gasping for breath. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the warped planks of the boardwalk, the filmy glass of the storefronts, the weary spirits of its inhabitants. Dust devils danced in the main street, like lonely ghosts, their brief, swirling lives a testament to the town's own transient nature. Laughter spilled from the saloon, but it was sharp and brittle cracking in the dry air. This was a place of simmering tensions, a town holding its breath, waiting for the next gust of violence to blow through. Stephanie Moss walked through it all, a wraith in a travel-stained dress. She kept her eyes down, her focus narrowed to the task at hand. The shock of the ambush had receded, leaving in its place a cold, hard resolve that felt like a stone in her gut. She moved with a purpose that set her apart from the aimless drifters and exhausted prospectors. She was no longer just surviving. She was hunting. Her first stop was the sheriff's office, a squat adobe building that seemed to sag under the weight of the sun. The sign above the door was faded, the word sheriff barely legible. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap tobacco, and the ink of forgotten paperwork. A man sat behind a cluttered desk, his face a roadmap of weary resignation. A tin star was pinned crookedly to his vest, its tarnished surface a perfect metaphor for the state of the law in redemption. Sheriff Stephanie's voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the dusty silence. The man looked up, his eyes a washed-out blue. "That's what the sign says." "What can I do for you, miss?" "I was on the stage from Prescott. We were robbed yesterday." The sheriff sighed a long, tired exhalation of air. He leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Bandits are thick as flies this season. You get a look at them. I got the leader's name, Silas Blackwood." The name hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. The sheriff's tired expression sharpened into one of genuine alarm. He sat forward, his forearms resting on the mountain of paper on his desk. Silas Blackwood, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. Mom, you're lucky to be standing here. Most folks who meet Silas Blackwood don't get to talk about it afterwards. He wasn't interested in money. Stephanie said, her voice steady. He took something from me. Something personal. A silver locket. The sheriff raised a skeptical eyebrow. Silas, the Vulture's Blackwood, the most ruthless outlaw in this territory, stops a stagecoach to steal a lady's necklace. Forgive me, miss, but that dog don't hunt. It's the truth. Stephanie leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of his desk. Her knuckles were white. He knew my name, or at least my family name. Moss. The sheriff's gaze shifted, a flicker of understanding dawning in his weary eyes. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of stubble loud in the quiet room. Dr. Alistair Moss was your father? Stephanie nodded, surprised. You knew him. Everyone knew the doc. Good man. Built the first clinic in this county. Patched up more cowboys and miners than I can count. He sold off his properties a few years back before he passed. Said he was moving back east. He paused, his expression growing grim. Miss Moss, you need to understand something. The last few months, Blackwood's gang has been hitting places all over this region. Ranches, homesteads, and old mining claim. At first, it seemed random. But now that you mention it, all those properties once belonged to your father. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. This wasn't about a locket. It was about her father. It was about his entire legacy. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a thief. He was an eraser, systematically wiping every trace of Alistair Moss from the face of the earth. I want you to form a posse. Stephanie said, her voice trembling slightly with the force of her conviction. I can help. I can identify him. The sheriff gave a short, bitter laugh. A posse, miss. I have 3 deputies, and one of them is 70 years old. You listen to me. Silas Blackwood ain't a man you chase. He's a storm you board the windows for. You take what little money you have left, and you get on the next stagecoach heading east. You forget this ever happened. He didn't take my money. Sheriff Stephanie said, her voice dropping each word precise, and waited. He took my past. I can't let that go. I won't. Sheriff Brody studied her for a long moment, seeing past the dusty dress and the tired lines on her young face. He saw the unbending steel in her spine, the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. It was a look he'd seen before, in men about to ride into a fight they couldn't possibly win. He sighed again, the sound filled with a profound sense of futility. There's nothing I can do for you, he said, his voice softer now. Officially. But if a person were looking for information, they might ask around at the saloon. Blackwood's men come in for supplies now and then. And if a person were determined to go after him, they'd need a good horse, plenty of water, and a miracle. He pushed a worn map across the desk. This shows the properties your father used to own. It's a fool's errand, miss. I hope you know that. I've been on a fool's errand my entire life. Sheriff Stephanie replied, taking the map. This is just the first time I know where I'm going. She walked out of the office and back into the unforgiving glare of redemption. She meticulously counted her few coins, the metallic clink, a stark reminder of her limited resources. With the sheriff's warning echoing in her ears, she bought not a stagecoach ticket, but a sturdy mare, 2 water skins, and a bag of hardtack. As she saddled the horse, her movements were efficient, her hands sure. She was no longer a ghost drifting through the territory. She had a name, a map, and a purpose forged in the cold fire of vengeance. She was the daughter of Alistair Moss, and she was going to reclaim her past or die in the attempt. The desert was a liar. It promised emptiness and delivered a world teeming with subtle signs, a language written in stone and sand. Stephanie's father, a man of science, had also been a man of the wilderness. He had taught her to read that language, how a bent twig could tell a story, how the scatter of pebbles could reveal the path of a horse, how the silence itself could speak of danger. Now those lessons were all she had. For 2 days she followed the trail left by Blackwood's gang, a clear, arrogant path that showed their contempt for pursuit. But on the 3rd day, the trail scattered the gang, splitting into smaller groups. Stephanie chose a direction based on the map, and a gut feeling pushing deeper into the labyrinth of canyons and mesas that bled into Apache territory. It was here the desert began to show its teeth. The sun was a merciless hammer beating down from a brassy sky. The heat warped the air, creating shimmering mirages that danced on the horizon like taunting spirits. Her water, warm and tasting of leather, was dwindling far too quickly. The trail grew faint, then vanished altogether. She was lost. The hunter had become the hunted, stalked not by a man, but by the land itself. By the 4th day, her horse was stumbling, its head low. Stephanie's own strength was failing. Her lips were cracked, her tongue thick in her mouth. The landscape began to swim before her eyes, the edges blurring into a dreamlike haze. Dehydration was a subtle thief, stealing her reason, her will. She dismounted, her legs buckling beneath her, and fell to her knees in the hot sand. The world tilted, the sky spinning into a vortex of blue and white. Her last coherent thought was one of bitter irony. After surviving everything, she would die alone, her quest unfulfilled, her name swallowed by the indifferent silence. She awoke to a face the color of the earth itself, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and time. Dark eyes regarded her without expression, their depths unreadable. An Apache. Panic, weak and fluttering, tried to take hold, but she was too exhausted to feel true fear. 2 other warriors stood behind him, their faces grim, their suspicion a palpable force. They did not look at her with pity, but with a hard, assessing curiosity, as if she were a strange creature washed up on the shores of their land. The one kneeling beside her offered a water skin. The gesture was not gentle, but practical. Stephanie drank the water, a shock of life in her parched throat. She drank too fast and choked, coughing weakly. The warrior took the skin back, waiting with unnerving patience until she recovered. "White woman," he said. The words were English, but shaped by a different tongue. "Why are you here? This is not your land." He was not much taller than she was, his body lean and corded with muscle. His hair hung in 2 long braids, and a single hawk feather was tied into one. He carried himself with an authority that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with presence. "I'm tracking someone," Stephanie rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "Men who robbed me." One of the other warriors spoke in a torrent of harsh, guttural Apache, gesturing angrily toward her. The leader listened, his gaze never leaving Stephanie's face. "Chayton says we should leave you." He translated, his voice flat. "He says you bring nothing but trouble. The soldiers will follow." "I'm not with the army," she insisted, struggling to sit up. "I'm alone." "Alone is a foolish way to be in this land," the leader observed. He looked at her, then a long, penetrating stare that seemed to see past her sunburnt skin and into the core of her. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the flicker of defiance that even exhaustion could not extinguish. "You have the eyes of a fighter," he said, more to himself than to her. Like the wolf caught in the trap who chews its own leg off to be free, he made a decision. He spoke to his companions in their own language, his tone calm but firm, a leader giving a command that would not be questioned. The one called Chayton spat on the ground but said nothing more. The leader turned back to Stephanie. "I am Maka," he said. "We will take you to our camp. You will rest. Then you will tell me why a lone white woman is hunting Silas Blackwood." The name spoken in this place by this man sent a jolt through her. "You know him?" A dark shadow passed over Maka's face. Every Apache knows the vulture. He kills without honor for reasons we do not understand. They pulled her onto one of their horses. The world swayed a nauseating rhythm of motion and pain. Her last glimpse before unconsciousness claimed her again was of Maka's back straight, unyielding a bulwark against the vast, cruel indifference of the desert. He hadn't rescued her out of kindness or compassion. She was a curiosity, a puzzle to be solved. And in the heart of Apache territory, Stephanie Moss had just become an entirely new kind of prisoner. The Apache camp was a living thing nestled in a hidden valley, like a hand resting in the palm of the mountains. It breathed with the rhythm of smoke from cooking fires and the laughter of children and the low murmur of a language that was as much a part of the landscape as the wind. For Stephanie, it was a place of profound dislocation. She was an alien creature, her pale skin and tattered calico dress a stark and unwelcome anomaly. Maka had delivered her to the wickiup of his mother Nulai, a woman whose face was a testament to enduring sorrow. Her eyes, as dark and sharp as her son's, held a permanent storm cloud of grief. Nulai accepted Stephanie's presence. With the same stoic resignation, she might have afforded a stray dog offering a sleeping mat and a bowl of stew, but no words, no welcome. The communication between them was one of brisk gestures and critical glances. For days, Stephanie existed in a state of limbo, recovering her strength, while navigating a world of unspoken rules. She learned through observation, her senses sharpened by a lifetime of being an outsider. She saw the deference shown to the elders, the communal way the women worked the fierce pride in the warrior's bearing. She was an object of suspicion, a potential threat. The other women ignored her, the warriors looked through her, and the children stared from a safe distance. Her first real test came when a young boy chasing a lizard among the rocks fell and suffered a deep, jagged gash on his leg. The tribe's medicine man chanted and applied a poultice of mud and leaves, but by the next day, the wound was inflamed red streaks creeping up the boy's skin and the unmistakable sign of a festering infection. The boy's fever climbed, and his mother's wails filled the camp. Stephanie watched her heart aching with a helplessness that was all too familiar. Then a memory surfaced her father, cleaning a ranch hand's wound, his voice calm and instructive. Asterisk, the enemy is what you can't see, Stephanie. The dirt. You have to wash it out. Give the body a clean place to heal. Asterisk. She approached Nulai, who sat grimly outside the sick boy's dwelling. Using a combination of gestures and the few Apache words she had picked up, Stephanie tried to explain. Fire, water, clean cloth. Nulai eyed her with deep mistrust. To interfere was to challenge the medicine man, to disrespect their traditions. Desperate, Stephanie turned to Maka, who was watching from a distance. His blood is poisoned, she said, her voice low and urgent. In my world, we have ways to fight this. Please let me try. If I fail, you can do whatever you want with me. Maka considered her, his expression unreadable. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but also a certainty, a knowledge that seemed out of place. He exchanged a few quiet words with his mother. Nulai finally gave a single reluctant nod. Working quickly, Stephanie had them boil water. She tore a strip from her own dwindling supply of clean linen. Ignoring the medicine man's hostile glare, she gently washed the boy's wound, cleaning away the dirt and the useless poultice. The boy whimpered in pain, but his mother held him steady, her eyes fixed on Stephanie's face. Then, remembering another of her father's lessons, Stephanie looked for a particular plant she had seen growing by the stream yarrow, he had called it, nature's bandage. She crushed the leaves into a paste and applied it to the clean wound before binding it tightly. For 2 days she sat with the boy, bathing his face with cool water, forcing sips of broth between his lips. Nulai sat with her, a silent, watchful sentinel. On the 3rd morning, the boy's fever broke. By evening, the angry redness around the wound had begun to recede. He was going to live. The change in the camp was subtle but immediate. The women's stares were no longer hostile but curious. The children no longer ran from her. Nulai, in a gesture of profound significance, handed Stephanie a deerskin dress, its soft leather, a silent acknowledgement of her new fragile place within the tribe. Maka's scouts, meanwhile, continued to bring reports of Silas Blackwood. The vulture was not behaving like a normal outlaw. He wasn't selling the cattle he stole. He was slaughtering them and leaving the carcasses to rot. He wasn't robbing homesteads for valuables. He was burning them to the ground. It was a campaign of annihilation, a scorched earth policy directed at the memory of Alistair Moss. As Stephanie's standing in the tribe grew, so too did her alliance with Maka. He began to see her not as a liability, but as a resource. She knew how the white man thought, how he moved the logic behind his maps and property lines. He in turn knew the land as if it were a part of his own body. They began to work together, poring over the sheriff's map by firelight, combining her knowledge with his scouts' reports, trying to predict Blackwood's next move. Their fragile partnership was complicated by a new and dangerous variable. A cavalry patrol larger and more aggressive than usual began sweeping the territory. They were led by Major Harold Blackwood, a man known for his rigid adherence to doctrine and his unyielding hatred of the Apache. The major was a man of straight lines and clear-cut morality, and the news that his own estranged son was the notorious outlaw tearing up the territory was a source of deep and private shame. He hunted Silas with a cold fury, but in his mind, the Apache were part of the same savage sickness infecting the land. He saw no distinction between them, creating a volatile three-way conflict where Stephanie and Maka were trapped in the middle, tracking a madman while being hunted by the law. The desert was no longer just a physical obstacle. It was a chessboard, and they were the most vulnerable pieces in a deadly game. The air at the burned-out homestead was thick with the ghosts of smoke and sorrow. This had been her father's first home in the territory, a small ranch nestled in a valley that was now a field of blackened timbers and gray ash. Silas had been here. The destruction was his signature, thorough and hateful. "He is trying to unmake the world your father built," Maka said quietly, his eyes scanning the devastation. "He's trying to unmake me." Stephanie corrected, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. "I'm the last part of it." They moved through the ruins, a shared somber purpose guiding their search. They were not looking for valuables, but for answers for anything that might explain the depths of Silas's obsession. In the rubble of what must have been the study, Stephanie's foot caught on something solid beneath the ash. She knelt, digging with her bare hands, and uncovered a small singed metal box. It was a strong box, the kind used for important documents. The lock had been melted shut, but the contents might have survived. Using a rock, Maka forced the warped lid open. Inside, a collection of papers had been charred beyond recognition, turning to dust at the slightest touch. But at the very bottom, protected by the layers above, lay a single photograph, its edges curled and browned by the heat. Stephanie gently lifted it. The image was of two people standing in the summer sun before an unblemished version of the very house they now stood in. One was a younger, smiling Alistair Moss. The other was a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a smile that radiated a vibrant, joyful life. She was beautiful. Stephanie turned the photograph over. On the back, in her father's familiar script, was an inscription asterisk, Alistair and Alara Summer of 65. A friendship that heals all wounds. Alara. Stephanie whispered the name, feeling strange on her tongue. Maka, looking over her shoulder, went still. "Alara Blackwood," he said, his voice low. "Silas's younger sister. She died many years ago. The story among the settlers was that she fell ill with a wasting sickness. The world seemed to stop, the sounds of the wind and the rustling grass fading into a deafening roar in Stephanie's ears. Alara Blackwood, her father's friend. Silas Blackwood's sister. It wasn't a random connection. It was the heart of the entire tragedy. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a horrifying, sickening click. Silas's rampage wasn't about land or money or some abstract vendetta against settlers. It was personal. It was a monument to his grief, built from the ashes of her father's life. He believed with the unshakable conviction of a zealot that Dr. Alistair Moss was responsible for his sister's death. Every burned homestead, every slaughtered cow, every act of terror was a step on his pilgrimage of revenge. And the locket. It wasn't just a memento. It was a symbol of the Moss family, the last remnant of a legacy he was determined to erase from the earth. He thinks my father killed her. Stephanie said the words tasting like ash. That's why he's doing this. And I am the final target. The revelation was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She was not a random victim caught in the crossfire of a bandit's greed. She was the specific intended conclusion to a cold, calculated plot that had been simmering for years. This entire journey, the ambush, the desert, on her time with the Apache, had not been a series of chance encounters. It was a collision course, a destiny she hadn't known was hers, drawing her inexorably toward a man who saw her not as a person, but as the final sentence in a story of revenge. Maka placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the spinning chaos of her thoughts. "This changes things," he said, his voice grim. "It changes nothing." Stephanie replied, her own voice startlingly firm. She looked up, her eyes clear and hard. "It just gives the monster a name and a face. And a destination." She looked at the map, at the one remaining property marked with her father's name, an abandoned silver mine, deep in the Dragoon Mountains. "I know where he's going next. He's saving the biggest piece of my father's legacy for last." Her quest for justice had transformed into a fight for survival. She was no longer just chasing a thief. She was racing a killer to the place he had chosen for her grave. The race to the Dragoon Mountains was a desperate flight through a land that had suddenly become a closing fist. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every canyon an ambush. News from Maka's scouts was grim. Major Blackwood's cavalry, guided by a tracker who knew the terrain, had found their trail. Simultaneously, Silas and his gang were moving toward the same destination, the abandoned Morning Star mine. Stephanie and Maka were caught in the jaws of a pincer, a small band of Apache warriors trapped between the cold, methodical justice of the U.S. Army and the hot, chaotic madness of the Blackwood gang. They rode hard, pushing their horses and themselves to the limits of endurance. The air grew thin and cold as they climbed into the high country, a jagged landscape of granite peaks and whispering pines. It was here, in a narrow pass, littered with boulders, that the fist finally closed. The cavalry appeared on the ridge behind them, a line of blue-coated riders stark against the sky. At the same time, shots echoed from the pass ahead, Silas's men blocking their path. Major Harold Blackwood, viewing the scene through his field glasses, saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see: a band of Apache savages caught in the company of his son's gang. He did not see two separate groups. He saw one confederacy of lawlessness. The woman Stephanie Moss was clearly their captive, caught in the middle. "They're together," he roared to his lieutenant. "The savages have allied with my son. Fire at will. Take them all." The order, born of a father's shame and a commander's misguided certainty, unleashed hell in the pass. Bullets ricocheted off the granite walls, the sharp crack of army carbines mingling with the deeper boom of the outlaws' rifles. The Apache, caught completely by surprise, scattered for cover, their warrior instincts taking over. "We have to get out of the pass." Maka yelled to Stephanie over the din. "Follow me." He spurred his horse not forward into the outlaws' guns or backward into the cavalry's advance, but sideways, up a steep, treacherous slope that was more rockslide than trail. Stephanie followed without hesitation, her mare scrambling for purchase on the loose scree. Behind them, the battle devolved into a chaotic three-way firefight. The outlaws, realizing the army was not there to negotiate, fought with cornered animal ferocity. The Apache attacked without provocation, returned fire with deadly accuracy, fighting a desperate battle for survival. The chase was a vertical nightmare. They climbed higher, the sounds of the battle fading below them, replaced by the rasp of their own breathing and the frantic panting of their horses. They were exposed, a prime target for any marksman, but the sheer chaos of the fight below worked in their favor. No one was paying attention to the two riders making an impossible escape up the mountainside. They broke over the crest of the ridge, finding themselves in a forest of ancient twisted pines. They were alive, but they were alone. The fierce, desperate fight in the pass had served an unintentional purpose. It had separated them from their allies, cutting them off from the rest of Maka's warriors. Maka reined in his horse, his body tense, as he listened to the faint sounds of battle echoing up from the valley. A stray bullet had grazed his arm, a shallow wound that bled freely onto his leather shirt, but he seemed not to notice. His face was a mask of cold fury and grim resolve. "They will pay for this," he said, his voice low and dangerous, not speaking of Silas, but of the soldiers who had attacked his people without cause. Later, Stephanie said, her voice tight with urgency, "Silas is still heading for the mine. We can't let him get there and fortify his position." She knew they were walking into a trap. With Maka wounded and both of them exhausted, facing Silas, and what remained of his gang was suicide. But turning back was not an option. This had to end here, in the place where her father's ambitions had once soared. A dark storm was gathering over the peaks, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The first drops of cold rain began to fall, slicking the pine needles on the forest floor. The mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the final act. Alone and outnumbered, with the sky ready to break open above them, Stephanie and Maka rode toward the gaping maw of the Morning Star mine. The entrance to the Morning Star mine was a dark wound in the mountainside, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of wet rock and decay. Timbers gray and splintered with age framed the opening, groaning under the strain of the earth. Outside, the storm had broken its leash. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, and thunder cannoned between the peaks, each clap a deafening percussion that shook the very ground beneath their feet. They left their horses in a thicket of pines and crept toward the entrance. Inside, a single lantern cast a pool of sickly yellow light, revealing Silas Blackwood. He was alone. The battle in the pass had evidently cost him his gang. He stood over a pile of dynamite, methodically setting charges, a grim and solitary architect of destruction. "He means to bring the whole mountain down." Maka whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. His wounded arm was bound tightly with a strip of Stephanie's dress, but his face was pale in the flickering light. "This ends now," Stephanie said, her voice a low, steady hum of resolve. She drew the small pistol she'd bought in redemption. It felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. She stepped out from behind the rocks into the mouth of the mine. "Silas." He spun around his face, a mask of surprise that quickly curdled into a triumphant sneer. He held a Winchester rifle, its barrel leveled at her heart. "The little bird," he said, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Come to see the nest destroyed. How fitting. Your father's greatest ambition, his precious mine, will be his tomb. And yours." Why? Stephanie's voice did not waver. "Why all this hate? My father was your sister's friend." Silas laughed, a raw, broken sound that held no humor. "Friend? He was her killer. He poisoned her, watched her die, and called it medicine." Maka moved then, a blur of motion from the shadows, tackling Silas from the side. The rifle clattered to the stone floor. The two men crashed against the tunnel wall, a tangle of desperate thrashing limbs. It was a brutal, primitive fight, Maka weakened by his wound, fighting with calculated Apache skill. Silas, fueled by years of simmering rage, fighting with the wild ferocity of a madman. Stephanie scrambled for the fallen rifle, just as a deafening crack echoed from deeper in the mine. A support beam weakened by years of neglect and shaken by the storm had snapped. A cascade of rock and dirt poured from the ceiling, partially blocking the entrance and plunging them into near-total darkness, the lantern having been smashed in the struggle. The fight continued in the suffocating dark, illuminated only by brilliant, terrifying flashes of lightning from outside. In one of those flashes, Stephanie saw Silas drive a knife into Maka's side. Maka cried out, stumbling back, clutching the new wound. Stephanie screamed, raising the rifle. Silas turned toward the sound of her voice, his eyes glittering with manic triumph in the next flash of lightning. He dies first. Then you join your father in hell. He lunged for her, but another tremor shook the mine. The ground heaved, and Silas lost his footing. He fell backward, his head striking a rock outcropping with a sickening crack. He lay still. Stephanie rushed to Maka's side. The new wound was serious, bleeding profusely. Outside, the storm raged, and water began to pour into the mine, a muddy torrent that swirled around their ankles. The mine was flooding, collapsing. "We have to get out," she said, trying to pull Maka to his feet. As she did, Silas stirred. He pushed himself up, his face a bloody mask, his eyes wild with a pain that went far beyond his physical injury. "He took her from me," he rasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "She wrote to me, begged me to come home. Said the pain was unbearable. Said the good doctor had promised her a final peace." He stopped, his own words seeming to hang in the air. Stephanie froze the details of his rant, suddenly aligning with a memory. A locked journal of her father's she had found among the debris in the strong box, its pages mostly ruined, but one entry protected from the flames, legible. Alara's suffering is immense. She begs me for release. The greatest mercy is sometimes the hardest sin to bear. God forgive me for what I must do at her request. The truth in all its tragic horror flooded through her. "It wasn't murder, Silas," she said, her voice shaking with the force of the revelation. "It was mercy. She was dying, and she asked him to help her. She made him promise not to tell you, to spare you the pain of knowing she chose to die." For a single heart-stopping moment, comprehension seemed to dawn in Silas's eyes, a flicker of understanding that his entire life's vengeful purpose had been built on a foundation of lies, a terrible, compassionate misunderstanding of his sister's final wish. The realization did not bring peace, but a final shattering agony. He let out a wordless scream of despair. At that moment, a larger section of the tunnel roof gave way. The ground beneath them fractured. A chasm opened in the mine floor, a black maw that began to swallow rock and debris. Silas, standing on the unstable edge, teetered. The silver locket, which he had worn on a leather cord around his neck, was snagged on a splintered timber just at the edge of the precipice. At the same time, Maka, weakened and disoriented, was pinned by a fallen beam and the rising water swirling around him. Stephanie was faced with an impossible choice. The locket, her past, the tangible link to her parents, the object that began this entire nightmare, was within reach. But so was Maka, her future, her home, the man she loved. The choice was not a choice at all. She ignored the locket. She threw all her strength into leveraging the heavy beam off Maka, her muscles screaming in protest. As she pulled him free, the ground gave a final violent shudder. With a last despairing cry, Silas Blackwood and the crumbling ledge he stood on plunged into the darkness. The silver locket, her last tie to the past, tumbled after him, swallowed by the earth. Dragging Maka behind her, Stephanie scrambled toward a faint glimmer of light, a secondary air shaft now partially exposed by the collapse. Behind them, the Morning Star mine. On the final monument to her father's legacy, and Silas's grief, was committing suicide, consuming itself in a final thunderous roar of rock and water. They emerged from the airshaft into a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised dawn sky and the clean, sharp scent of rain on pine. They were battered, bleeding, and caked in mud, but they were alive. Stephanie helped Maka to the shelter of an overhanging rock, his weight heavy against her, his breathing shallow. They had survived, but the cost had been immense. As the sun crested the mountains, casting long shadows across the ravaged landscape, a lone figure on horseback approached. Not a soldier, not an outlaw, but Major Harold Blackwood. He rode slowly, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos, his face a mask of stone. He stopped a few yards away, his gaze falling on the collapsed mine, then on the two survivors huddled beneath the rock. Stephanie braced herself for the end, for the arrest, the accusations. But the Major's eyes held no anger, only a profound, hollowed-out weariness. One of his scouts searching the pass after the battle had found the metal box she had dropped in her haste. He had found the photograph of his daughter smiling beside Dr. Moss, and he had found the singed page from her father's journal. He had found the truth. "He was my son," the Major said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if speaking of a stranger. "And I see now he died a long time ago. What was left was just an echo of his grief." He looked at Stephanie, his gaze lingering on her face, seeing not a captive or a criminal, but another survivor of the tragedy that had consumed both their families. He saw the fierce, protective way she held the wounded Apache warrior, the unyielding strength in her eyes. This was not a woman who needed rescuing. The official report will state that Silas Blackwood and his gang were killed in the collapse of the mine while resisting arrest. He stated, his voice taking on a formal, distant tone. There were no other survivors found. The meaning was clear. He was erasing them from the official story, giving them a chance to disappear. He was ending the cycle of violence and revenge that had cost him his son and had almost cost Stephanie her life. Without another word, Major Blackwood turned his horse and rode away, a solitary, broken man, disappearing into the morning mist, leaving Stephanie and Maka to their uncertain future. A few hours later, as the sun climbed higher, new figures appeared. Not soldiers this time, but Apache warriors. Led by a grim-faced Nulai, the survivors of the battle in the pass had followed their trail. Relief washed over Nulai's stoic features at the sight of her living son, a rare crack in her formidable armor. The warriors gathered around them, their expressions a mixture of relief and somber respect. They had seen the collapsed mine, had heard the Major's retreating horse. They understood, without needing words, that a great battle had been fought and won. Their trust in Stephanie, the white woman who had fought beside them, who had saved their leader not once but twice, was now absolute. She was no longer an outsider. She was one of them, forged in the crucible of shared loss and survival. As they gently lifted Maka onto a travois to begin the slow journey back to their people, Stephanie knew she was finally truly going home. Months later, the land was quiet, resting under a thick blanket of winter snow. In a hidden valley protected from the harshest winds, the Apache tribe had made their winter grounds. Life had found its rhythm again, the steady work of survival, the comfort of community, the quiet passage of time. In the warmth of their own wickiup, a healed Maka carved a piece of pine wood. Stephanie sat beside him, mending a pair of moccasins, her belly round, with the promise of new life. The child within her was a bridge, a joining of two worlds, a symbol of a future she had never dared to dream of. One afternoon, as the low winter sun cast a golden glow across the snow, they stood together on a high mesa overlooking their new home. The air was cold and still, the world silent and at peace. Maka took her hand and placed the finished carving in her palm. It was a small hawk, its wings outstretched, its eyes sharp and clear, every detail rendered with loving precision. "The locket is gone," he said, his voice soft. "It was a part of you." Stephanie closed her fingers around the smooth, warm wood. "It was a memory of a life I'd already lost," she said. "A ghost I carried because I had nothing else. The past is a stone." Maka said, his dark eyes holding hers. "You do not have to carry it. Our future is the sky." She looked from the small hawk in her hand to the vast, endless sky above them. He was right. Her identity was no longer tied to a silver locket, to the faded portraits of people she could barely remember. Her identity was here in this moment, with this man, with this people. It was forged not in where she had come from, but in who she had chosen to become. Her home was not a place on a map, but a feeling of belonging so profound it had reshaped her soul. She leaned in and kissed him a kiss filled with the quiet certainty of a lifetime of tomorrows. As they stood there wrapped in a shared silence, Nulai approached them, her steps sure on the snowy path. She stopped before Stephanie, her expression softer than Stephanie had ever seen it. She reached out her weathered hand, gently resting on Stephanie's swollen abdomen. A slow smile spread across her face, a rare and beautiful sunrise. In clear, perfect English, a skill she had kept hidden like a precious stone, Nulai spoke, her voice filled with a fierce and joyful pride. "My grandchild will be born a warrior,